Hello, good afternoon. Glad you all could make it. The weather was absolutely a lot better this time than it was last time. Hello to you people there in Moorhead as well. Today we got the pleasure of having Larry Hancock. Larry Hancock is, well, let me just read his bio here. Larry Hancock graduated from the University of New Mexico, earning his BA with honors and completing majors in history, cultural anthropology, and education. Following service in the United States Air Force, he pursued a career in technical education, computer communications, and technology and marketing. Following retirement, he returned to his interest in military and Cold War history, became known as the document geek, publishing several collections of CIA, FBI, and military documents, and becoming a board member of the Mary Ferrell Foundation, which is a major online interactive history archive. Turning to writing, he has a dozen of books in print exploring covert actions, deniable warfare, 1960s political assassinations, and the national security challenge of UFOs. Currently, he serves as an SCU, which is the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, an SCU board member, and has been leading a study team devoted to applying intentions and analysis techniques to UAP activities in both the military and public domains. The team has published 2 peer-reviewed papers, with the 3rd coming out this month and a 4th in progress. Larry, thanks for being with us this afternoon. I really appreciate it, and looking forward to what you have to say. So the floor is yours.
Well, it's great to be here. I know Rich was originally scheduled. Rich and I share a couple of things. We're both board members, and we're both have been involved in this since the mid-60s. So at least we have the same, time frame involved. It's kind of strange that there are so many of us still living that have been into this thing since like 1964 and 1965. But I'll be speaking from notes today, so every once in a while you might see me look down and glance, because there's a lot of material in there. My focus is and will be today on UFOs and UAPs and basically their history with the intelligence community, the national intelligence community. And an interesting thing is most people really don't. We all think of this as kind of starting in 1947, unless you go back to the Foo Fighters and World War II. But in reality, American intelligence and British intelligence first became involved with the subject of UFOs immediately following World War II in 1946. And that was because of a series of essentially what were referred to as ghost rocket sightings over the Scandinavian nations, starting with Sweden and then spreading further out. And of course, both countries were very much curious and very involved with what was going on at that time with the emergence of Russia, the early stages of the Cold War. And when the Swedes started reporting sightings of objects that appeared to be missile-like, rocket-like, if you will, at moderate altitudes and crashing into lakes, and then other reports of objects that looked very much like the V1 World War II era pulse jets, there was a lot of interest. One early speculation from among the Swedes and Swedish press was that this was Russian, that the Russians were testing these devices, that they were sending them over Sweden and over the Scandinavian countries as part of testing out of the Peenemünde facility in Germany, where, of course, Germany had done its development of the V2 ballistic missile and the V1 pulse jet cruise missile type that we think of today. So that got a lot of publicity. And at the time, the British were actually much more involved intelligence-wise with the Swedes than we were. And the British actually started covertly sending in military representatives to liaise with Swedish intelligence and then with a couple of the other countries. And the U.S. got involved as well. But this was all very covert, because it was the earliest stages of the Cold War, and to some extent everyone was being a bit cooperative. The British had actually test fired V2 ballistic missiles from the Peenemünde area themselves before pulling back out of that. And the Russians took it over. So the British had done some testing of their own V2s, and the Americans would be testing V2s, but in New Mexico. They transported them back and were going to be doing all their testing. So of course, both parties were interested because they absolutely knew that the Russians had taken over and collected a goodly amount of World War II era German aerospace technology, rockets, jets, and that they had acquired a lot of German scientists. So there was a lot of interest in what this might represent. The British actually helped the Swedes by sending in radar systems. The United States actually covertly conducted aerial reconnaissance flights over some of the islands that were then controlled by the Russians that had been identified by radar as possible launch sites. So this was kind of like really the first involvement of American intelligence with the phenomena, flying objects, UAPs, whatever we choose to call them at the moment. But it was all definitely all undercover. Even the personnel traveling into Sweden went under covers and not as military officers. And there was a real serious intelligence investigation that was conducted under the auspices of what then was called the Central Intelligence Group. The Central Intelligence Group was the precursor of what became the CIA. It existed during a brief intermediate period during 1946 into early 47 before the CIA was formally organized. And interestingly enough, we have access to a lot of the correspondence that went back and forth, and they're taking this very seriously. And actually, the U.S. Central Intelligence Group issued an official opinion, classified opinion, of course, that these things were very real, that they were real objects, that they had been observed in flight, that they had crashed, had physical objects, no ifs, ands, or buts about the fact that they were real. However, in their opinion, they were indeed basically Russian adaptations of German technology. And the Russians were specifically, they weren't just testing them, they were firing them over countries like Sweden as part of essentially an intimidation program. Because at this point in time, Russia was bidding for the attention of these countries, the Norwegian, Scandinavian countries, bidding for their attention, wanted to keep them out of a Western alliance. There was a lot of competition going on economically, and they felt that this was actually part of in a sense, a political action campaign, and that Russia was doing it. The U.S., of course, had gained a lot of influence at that point in time by possessing atomic weapons. Well, this would be a way for the Russians to demonstrate that they had their own secret technology that was not only important and significant, but they were willing to use it as well. So that was the first official opinion that was tendered, and that was on file. And when you move in 1947, and we have all of what we're familiar with as far as the wave of UFO reports, and that was the context. So basically, when the United States started to look at UFO incidents reported inside the United States, they were looking at it with the background that this might well be the Russians. If the Russians had already been doing this over Scandinavia, perhaps the Russians were doing it over the United States. And so, again, in a very evolutionary process without necessarily announcing it to the public, the Air Force began a move to investigate UFOs very seriously. And I think it's kind of fascinating because at the time, when we look at the public information releases from the Air Force, when we look at the public relations interviews with the Air Force, they clearly marginalize the subject. They essentially make fun of it. If you just look at the general press reports from 1947, it moves from, very serious reports to interviews with scientists and Air Force officers, and by the end of the summer, it's become almost a joke. But the Air Force was not at all treating it in that fashion. The Air Force had assigned the study of these reports to the Air Material Command at Wright-Patterson. So one of the questions, if kind of into the subject, the question would be, why would they be assigning it to AMC rather than keeping it within Pentagon Air Intelligence? And the reason they assigned it to AMC, because AMC, Air Materials Command, was the repository for all of the German and technical aerospace intelligence that had been collected during the war. Air Materials Command was chartered with reviews of foreign technology, foreign air, rocket, missile, aircraft technology. And the assumption was from the very beginning that if anybody had the expertise to evaluate this subject, especially if it was indeed derivative of German advancements, then it would be AMC that would do it. And so that's why AMC was tasked with the intelligence. And I think the thought was very likely that one of these things might crash, it might be recovered. And again, that's where the expertise to collect and examine materials was. They had the engineering teams that were familiar with propulsion, were familiar with aircraft, structural materials. So that's why it was left with AMC. The problem with that is AMC didn't have a lot to work with, and especially during 1947 and then 1948, they didn't have a lot of data. They were used to having data. They were used to having parts, materials from crashes. That had been very common during the war. They had teams that had evaluated Japanese and Russian technology, but they didn't have any pieces. They also did not have what we would almost take for granted now, which would be film footage or radar, in particular radar tracks, because at that point in time, following the war, there literally was not a national air defense structure with the United States. So many people had immediately been taken out of service. By 1944, 1945, there was no real threat of attack on the United States, continental United States. So pretty much all the air defense systems and the interceptors had been moved overseas into the theaters of war. So there literally were virtually no operational radars in the United States, so there was no tracking. And that in reality was a real part of the problem, because the Air Force and the national intelligence community had already been issuing warnings that they were anticipating a potential Russian airstrikes, especially as soon as Russia got the atomic weapons. And early on, there was a real concern that we were not at all prepared for that. And there were some calls to establish an air defense network, but just as they started to move into that, the Korean War developed, and again, all of the resources that were available ended up being deployed overseas. So from the period of 1947 to late 1950, 1951, there didn't exist what we would take for granted now, which would be, a real air defense network with interceptors, with gun cameras, with radar tracking. And that it left Air Materials Command without the kind of data that it was used to do the engineering and technical analysis of foreign technology. However, what they could do is collect reports, which is what they did. They collected a lot of reports. There were a lot of reports coming in from military sightings in the continental United States, as well as from Alaska, Newfoundland. And one of the things that was worrisome about that is the reports started coming in from locations that were being considered as what would have been the strike routes for Russian preventive strikes. And that worried a lot of people. In fact, when radars did become available, the first radars were deployed in the Pacific Northwest and later in the Northeast, specifically because those were the anticipated attack routes. So again, in 1947, when we see a whole collection of reports coming out of the Pacific Northwest, not just Kenneth Arnold, but Seattle, Washington State, all over the Northwest. That again helped to confirm the concerns that this was possibly a Soviet reconnaissance. And by September of 1947, Air Materials Command issued its first estimate of the situation. This did not make the press. This was totally classified. The AMC estimate of the situation were that UFOs were real. They were actual devices. There was nothing fictitious about them, despite some of the reporting. It was something to be taken seriously. And AMC went so far as to actually issue basically a tasking document that says, look, here's the profile of the UFO. Here's size, shape, maneuverability, speeds, a full profile of the UFO, and was handed off to the intelligence organization within the Air Force and basically said, okay, these are foreign devices. We need to find out more about them. And yes, this is real. Take it seriously. And that was handed off to Air Intelligence. As I said, that's the sort of thing that did not appear in the press and was actually very contrarian to what was appearing in the press. But at that point in time, AMC and Air Intelligence was taking it very seriously. The FBI had taken it seriously for the time. They were collecting reports. One of the problems was that basically Director Hoover of the FBI got hold of a copy of an Air Force memo that said, well, let's let all of the investigation of the reports, let's let the FBI look into it, especially stuff that appears like it's a hoax. And Hoover was upset. It's kind of like, well, no, we're not gonna take your leavings. So he pulled the FBI back out of it after several months of interest, and they had investigated several hoaxes that were going on in 1947. So by the end of 1947, it's real. AMC says it's real and starts dispatching teams overseas because what their assumption is that this is German technology, that the Soviets have adapted. They're using it for reconnaissance. They're militarizing it. And so they need to trace that technology from Germany into Russia. And a project was created within the Air Force to do that. It was funded. It was officially assigned, and that was called Project Sign. And they were looking for signs of that technology. The problem is they didn't find it. And as a matter of fact, what happened, within about 6 months, they did track down the technology that they thought was being adapted, which was the Horton Flying Wing, some of the jet propulsion technology associated with it. There had been rumors that the Soviets were building a fleet of adapted Horton jet attack bombers. They couldn't confirm that. And by a point in time in 1948, what they thought was going to be a sure thing to wrap up this investigation totally petered out and came to nothing. And so in 1948, Sign is left with virtually no actually hard data. They're left with a trail that didn't pan out to German technology. And what happens at that point in time is actually a group within Air Materials Command, within Project Sign, actually had become intrigued by some of the airlines reports of rocket-like craft, and they actually, believe it or not, prepared an estimate that said that some of these sightings at least could well be interplanetary craft. And that was kicked all the way up to the head of Air Force intelligence, who kicked it directly back down and said, you guys don't really have any proof of that. Your case is not strong enough. I don't want to hear it. The people that submitted that estimate were reassigned. It did no good at all for their careers, something that you'd find later occurring to Air Force staff that came up with that sort of view. And Project Sign got the word basically. And those people that have really studied it and studied the memos, it's sort of like, these people are smart. They see what's going on. They see what happened to the guys that said, oh, it could be interplanetary. So Project Sign tends to take a tack towards simply explaining UFO reports as natural phenomena, misidentifications, etc., which is really too bad, because it's exactly at that time during 1948 and 49 that the really good reports start coming in. And actually during that point in time, but the strange thing is they don't necessarily, Sign doesn't pay any attention to them. But during that period of time, there are actually 2 or 3 very significant recoveries of what to be materials from just parts, not anything big, but debris and parts from UFO impacts. And some of those do get, we have documents on that. Some of those do get evaluated, but not within the Air Force. For example, there was an incident that occurred close to Dow Chemical Company. That was evaluated in Dow Labs. There was another incident in an event that ended up at the National Standards Bureau. And I describe some of these in detail in my book, Unidentified, and some very interesting materials composition results come out of that. Nothing really, foreign, extraplanetary, but very interesting in terms of materials design. In one instance, it looks to be exactly like what you would find in a rocket chamber. In fact, one of the guys involved in the examination who had been working with the V2s at White Sands goes, hey, this looks like one of the composite linings for something that we're launching, except of course it was recovered in the Midwest. So it gets to be, but the Air Force doesn't engage with that. It doesn't engage later with another similar incident in 1952 where materials are recovered. It just takes the report and ostensibly doesn't do much with it. But of course, they're very busy explaining everything that they possibly can. And the other thing is that during 1948, 1949, we begin to have a first wave of truly significant observations from the atomic weapons complex. Hanford plant, Oak Ridge plant, Los Alamos, even White Sands. And more importantly, as time goes on, from the nuclear weapon storage sites, such as the weapon storage site at Killeen Base, which, if you've read Kehoe's books, became a real serious thing. It was reported to the Air Force. The Army took it seriously because they were doing security at the area and it was near a big Army base. The FBI took it very seriously, and Project Sign at the Air Force pretty much just totally ignored it, even though it was reported to them. And one of the most fascinating things is that these sightings at Killeen Base were actually observed over weeks and months by teams of Army artillery spotters. And the activity had been such large scale and so ongoing that the Army was taking it seriously enough to man observation posts to do triangulated observations. That's what these guys were trained to do for artillery fire location, and actually come up with triangulated observations to give you the speed, altitude, duration. All that data was gathered up by the Army, sent to the Air Force, and nobody did anything with it. Project Sign didn't do anything with it. Fortunately, researchers have dug that up. We actually have it today, and you can even see the calculation sheets from the observation locations. But it's kind of funny to listen to contemporary people talk about the subject and say, oh, if we only had solid data, if we only had real official instrumented observations of these things, we would absolutely know what was going on. Well, folks, you've had it since 1948 and 1949. You just apparently either don't know it or kind of missed out on this. So that's kind of how things were at the end of the decade of the 40s, going into the 50s, a lot of activity, project signing and in play, doing a lot of explanations, essentially dealing with the reports in a way so that they didn't become an issue that the Air Force was going to have to address, even though we had that official opinion that it was real. So I guess this would probably be a good point in time to see if there were any questions pertaining to this period of time.
You talked about a couple of crashes, other than the obvious Roswell and Corona, and a few others that I can think of off the top of my head. Where have some of these things crashed?
One was in Ohio. The other was in the Northeast, in the Massachusetts area, as I recall. And in both of those instances, these were, when I say crashes, what you've got is you got an UFO reported actually impacting the ground. Something like a fireball observed hitting the ground, and then you've got materials, parts, no, I shouldn't even say parts, but fragments that are recovered. And as I say, one of them was evaluated at Dow Labs, another was ended up in the National Bureau of Standards for evaluation.
Okay, thank you.
We have a question here in Moorhead.
Where is the Colleen nuclear base?
Colleen is in Texas, near Fort Hood. What happened is when atomic weapons first were built, a few were assembled at Los Alamos, then they started being built at Sandia Base in Albuquerque and stored in Albuquerque. And then from that point in time, at that point in time, the Air Force, to pick up an atomic weapon, actually had to fly a B-29 to Albuquerque and pick it up at that location. They weren't deployed. Then the decision was that they needed to be deployed because you didn't have all, if you're expecting a Soviet strike, you don't want to have them all in one place. So they started deploying them out to storage sites, which we call Q sites because of the special security clearance associated with them. And the Q sites were about half a dozen across the United States. Fort Hood, the Colleen site was one of the first. They were located near Air Force bases, but in a couple of instances, Colleen being kind of unique, there was also a large Army base associated with it. But they were not major Air Force bases because, again, you wanted to spread the stuff out as far as you could. So yeah, the Q sites really only lasted into the mid-1950s because at that point they began deploying the atomic weapons out to all the strategic command air bases, and of course following that to the Navy, to the ICBM bases. So the Q sites were only around and operational from like 1948 through 1954.
The ghost rockets, was there ever any recovered material or?
With the ghost rockets, is there ever any recovered material or any impact sites?
Yes, there were a number of impact sites. There was a reasonable amount of impact material. The Swedish Air Force did study that, and actually I think the US and Britain helped as well. And it was evaluated as being related. They did evaluate it as being related to rockets. That was one of the things that made them think they were a combination of V-1s and V-2s that the Soviets were sending over.
Perfect, thank you. Oh, we got something on chat here. Why do you think there were so many crashes?
Well, from what I can see, aside from Roswell, there really weren't. There, as far as the official records, as far as the reports go, there were 3 or 4 in the U.S. that you would consider places where something was a UFO was reported and something was recovered. And as I say, in the instances, don't want to go into Roswell because obviously that would be, another 3 hours all by itself. But in the instances I'm talking about, it appears that literally a projectile type device crash, not what we would normally think of as a maneuverable, UFO per se. And so I can't explain what crashed, neither could they, but there weren't that many of them. And they don't appear to be like a catastrophic failure. It was just like something came down and impacted. Now there were a whole lot of quote unquote green fireballs reported that were, similar to flares, similar to rockets. Generally speaking, those didn't crash. Those just passed overhead. And in some cases, they were triangulated and measured, but they did not crash. That was primarily over New Mexico and Texas in the 48-49 timeframe.
Another question here. Was the government shooting them down?
As a matter of fact, not only is there no evidence of that, we actually have records saying that orders were issued not to shoot down UFOs. Only if they could be identified as a threatening or as, actually as part of an attack, were you authorized to shoot them down. And that was very standard directive to the Air Force throughout the Cold War. There was only a period of time of about, I think, 8 months during 1948, and related only to objects that might be sighted over the atomic plants, were orders that were given to engage and take them down. And that was canceled. So there were no standing orders. There were no standing orders to engage them. In fact, there were orders not to engage and fire on them, just to intercept and identify. Yeah, I'm familiar with Missouri. In all honesty, I kind of weigh in with Kevin Randall on this sort of thing. I mean, Randall has written a book that evaluates like 150 so crash reports. Some of them Stringfield had done earlier. There really isn't, like the Missouri instance, that they're all stories. There's just no corroboration for them. I mean, Randall weighs in that his opinion, my opinion would be that those are good stories that largely came out of newspaper reporting in some instances. In some instances, they came down through families. But, all I can say is at this point, no corroboration for the one in Missouri. And he's the one that looked at it most recently.
We have another question here in Moorhead. Go ahead.
As far as the nuclear, was Hanford, Washington, and Umatilla, Oregon part of what was going on then?
Yeah, Hanford, Washington. The atomic plants were Hanford, Washington, and Oak Ridge. Okay, in Tennessee, those where the materials were being produced. Then they were shipped by rail to Los Alamos, which was where the atomic bombs used during World War II were assembled. And from then on, they were shipped down to Albuquerque to Sandia for assembly. Later on, the assembly in the early 60s moved to Pantex plant east of Amarillo, Texas. But yeah, Hanford, the atomic warfare complex in the 1950s and 60s would be defined as Hanford, Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, Sandia, and the Q sites.
Thank you. I just was curious, Umatilla, Washington, was that just like hazardous waste? You familiar with that?
I honestly am not familiar with that location.
Okay, thank you.
Of course, the Hanford Reservation is so big, and there was somebody. The Hanford Reservation itself was like 100 by 100 miles. So you kind of like some of the when we talk about some of the missile sites, it's like 1,000 square miles. So it includes a lot of places.
Yeah, Umatilla would be in there then. Thank you.
Yeah, we got one more over here. Go ahead.
When the event happened over Tunguska in Siberia in 1908, when an unknown aerial fireball detonated over the tundra and devastated vast regions of the land, some witnesses claimed that it made a curve or an arc as if trying to land before it detonated. Do you have any validity on that?
I didn't hear that in total. You're talking about the Russian incident? Did I get that right?
Over Siberia where it devastated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's been looked in. that's been looked into a lot, and actually even more recently during the latter part of the last decade. And they've now recovered enough fragments and actually located what appears to be the central body of what caused that. It appears to be more likely to have been a comet that actually entered the atmosphere and fragmented. And one of the reasons the airburst was so big was it wasn't like a stony or iron meteorite or something like that. It had less cohesion. So when it did blow apart, it blew apart over a wider area. But that's pretty much been resolved now.
How about that?
Tunguska or something like that is what we're talking about, I think.
Yeah, but how about some certain witnesses claim that it made an arc, a curve before it blew up, like it was maybe extraterrestrial?
Yeah, again, that is not totally unusual. Would not be unusual for something like that, in that it's it doesn't have a ballistic path, right? It's breaking apart as it's coming in. So depend on which parts are, actually glowing and fragmenting. You might track it other than in a completely straight line. And it's not totally unknown. As a matter of fact, I have a Sky and Telescope magazine over here on my shelf from about 1958 that has an article about another, what probably was an asteroid that entered orbit, maintained an orbital and then a suborbital trajectory, fragmented, and was observed appearing to be separate objects and maneuvering about 3/4 of the way around the globe before. But in any event, that's about all I can offer. I'm familiar with the report from the witnesses, and I know, again, it's one of those things. In the first books I started reading back in the 1960s, it was very mysterious. It's one of those that's become a little less so over time.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's it for questions right now.
Okay, let's go on to the next. Okay, so what really happened is, in the early part of the 50s, 2 or 3 things happened. Okay, first of all, the Korean War began to slow down. There actually became even more fears of a Soviet preemptive strike once they got atomic weapons. And there were intelligence forecasts that they were building a strategic bomber force equivalent to our B-29s, and a lot of real concern that especially the northeastern corridor and the west coast would be subjective to preemptive Russian strikes, basically intended to take out our industrial complex in the Midwest and the Northeast, and all the aircraft plants on the West Coast. So radars were deployed in the Northeast, on the West Coast. Interceptor groups were deployed, and we began to get a lot more radar tracking of UFOs. That doesn't necessarily explain what they were. We just began to get more radar tracking and some actual data, and more reports coming out of the military. Reports of interceptions and attempted interceptions, and a lot of them probably more persuasive, because the interceptors were getting up there, trying to engage with them, tracking them on radar, losing them off radar. You began to find simultaneous ground and air radar tracks of these objects, and they were clearly maneuvering in a fashion that would be considered intelligent. Pilots thought that they were actually being engaged. The things would come in, circle them, get on their tail. They felt threatened. In a couple of instances, one I particularly love over the Dakotas, a SAC bomber on a mission over Canada, as part of a routine mission, basically observed a UFO, reported it. On its way back to the US, it was tracked by the UFO, tracked by the aircraft, tracked by the ground. When it got into US Air Force airspace, it was intercepted. It ran away from the interceptor. The interceptor ran out of fuel. It followed the interceptor back towards the space. They sent up a separate interceptor. Anyway, playing games with it. These sorts of reports really started getting the attention of the military and started getting the attention of people in air intelligence. There was also a real concentration, ongoing concentrations of reports from the southwestern U.S., especially over New Mexico, Los Alamos, Sandia Base. This is when all the warheads and bombs were still at Sandia Base in New Mexico. And that began to worry air intelligence. And Sign gave way to Blue Book. And Blue Book was a much more serious investigations. That's where you find Captain Ruppelt, who later wrote a book on it, which I'm sure many of you have read on his experience. And they started investigating it more seriously and actually came up with sufficient proof for them. There were recommendations to air intelligence that they establish a formal observational network, an instrumented network, that they put special cameras on aircraft interceptors and go up looking for them. And Ruppelt and Blue Book made that recommendation to air intelligence, and air intelligence accepted it. Well, this is going into 1952. So they were really moving forward with that and taking it quite seriously. And then in the summer of 1952, there were a series of incidents up and down the northeast coast, basically Baltimore, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., New York, and starting in the spring of the year 1952. And that really, again, was establishing credibility for the fact that we needed a serious study, not just the Air Force, but bring all the intelligence community into it, move it up to a strategic tasking level, and take it seriously. Well, that summer, then over a period of 2 weeks, several incidents occurred directly over Washington, D.C. And I'm sure many of you have heard of the Washington, D.C. sightings. And a couple of things came out of that. First of all, they proved to be very embarrassing to the Air Force, because even when commercial air controllers, even when requests were generated to the Air Force that there were real foreign objects operating over the nation's capital, it took between an hour and 2 hours to get an interceptor over the Capitol. Think about this. This is like the height of the Cold War. Everybody has been concerned about a Soviet preemptive strike, and a UFO shows up over the Capitol and there's no interceptor there for an hour. This is not something the Air Force wants to talk about in detail to anybody. And when this happened twice, and the president became aware of it, he actually called the Air Force in, and we know that there was a special meeting between the president and the Air Force. We don't know what was said, but the memo title for the meeting is Defense of the Capitol. So you've got a pretty good idea of what the conversation was about. And the president was unhappy, and the Air Force didn't give him the answers he wanted to hear. They could, like, who was this? Well, we don't know. Where'd they come from? We don't know. None of the things he would want to hear. At that point in time, he got fed up with the Air Force and actually picked up the phone and called the director of the CIA, and essentially, we don't have a transcript, but essentially said, well, the Air Force can't tell me what's going on. Can you? And the CIA director handed it off to his technical intelligence division. And at first, the people in that division started going through some information. They were very negative towards what the Air Force had been doing, because they didn't think the Air Force had really been conducting a serious study of the subject. But after 2 or 3 months, and after being shown the information, some of the incidents that I've just talked about, the incidents from the atomic warfare complex, they actually wrote a memo to the director of the CIA saying, this is serious. This needs to be elevated to the level of national security tasking. It needs to go to the National Security Council. Here's the CIA and the Air Force in saying that finally this should be taken up to the level of strategic intelligence, at the highest level to be studied, not one-on-one reports, not, but studied as a pattern of activity, basically. Well, the director of the CIA actually proposed that. And the way things work in the hierarchy is that to get to the actually on the agenda for the National Security Council. The National Security Council has its own intelligence study group. So they said, you know, you're going to have to convince this group that you're really serious about this. These are real things. We don't know what they are. They're totally unexplained. They're intelligence and they're a threat. If you do that, then we'll put it on the agenda and maybe we'll take it on at a national security level. At that point in time, we've actually, some researchers have done some fantastic research on this, and we have that correspondence. I talk about it in the book, but the bottom line is the director of the CIA backed off and said, well, gee, I don't, you know, and the bottom line was he convened a panel, the CIA convened a panel with the Air Force participating called the Robertson Panel. You probably heard about that. And basically what it involved was neither the CIA nor the Air Force were going to be allowed to elevate this thing to a national security level unless they could line up a series of credible scientists to support them. Just their reports, their observation, their data, their photos, they needed to have academics lined up behind them to support it. They convened this panel. It was very hard to find anybody willing to serve on the panel. This has never been a subject that academia has been excited about because, let's face it, it's not repeatable. You can't do experiments with it. It's tough. And the Robertson panel met over a period of only like 3 days and produced a report that says, we're sorry, we can't confirm this, that these are real devices, you know. And the report that was crafted came back and said, yes, they should be considered from a security standpoint, but not that kind of security. There's a potential risk here because if people keep reporting these things in large numbers, they could actually affect our air defense. You know, a foreign power might do something to trigger hundreds of reports just before a real strike. It would confuse the whole system. It could divert attention. So there is a risk in UFOs, but the risk has to do with it as a threat from something we can't identify, but as a problem for our air defense system. So what you people need to do is make the public comfortable so they don't report too many of them. You know, you need to explain these. They're natural phenomena. They're misidentifications. And for the next decade or more, that's the way it went, based on the directives that came out of the Robertson panel meeting, like it or not. This is all documented. So it was seen as a security problem, if you will, but not as a national security problem where it was actually handed off to people who study national security issues as tasked by the National Security Council. And for the next, through the late 50s, through the early 60s, what you really find is Project Blue Book in the Air Force, in charge of the subject, collecting reports from anybody, you know, and you find no reports from the Army, virtually no reports from the Navy because nobody told them that they had to. You find some reports from the Coast Guard, and you find a lot of civilian reports and a lot of reports from the military, lots from pilots, lots from radar tracks, that sort of thing. But it's being carried out strictly at the level of the Air Force, dealing with reports and as the collections point for these reports. And their focus literally is on explaining. They take them one by one and explain them if possible, throw them in a bucket called unidentified if they can't do that, and then they publish statistics. And the whole point of the statistics is to show the unidentifieds are really not a significant numerically part of the reports, so you can kind of ignore those. There's not a single report. Every time they publish an annual report, it's like there's not been a single incident where a threat has been identified or where hostile action has been taken by a UFO We can't document any of that. There are very few of them that are unidentified. And so, you know, don't worry about it, and like, don't report it, and don't report them unless you really have to, because we don't want to deal with them. It pretty much translates to that. That's a little subjective, but that's the way it goes. And this becomes the era of where the civilian investigative bodies really start to gel. National NICAP, National Investigations Committee, APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. I was a member of both of them for periods of time. It becomes a process of essentially offloading some of the serious approach to it from the Air Force in particular, because the intelligence community has already left it with the Air Force. The intelligence community, which we think of today as, you know, a whole bunch of organizations, but back then was run by the NSC, had not accepted it as a problem. They had left it with the Air Force to deal with. The Air Force deals with it statistically, and by saying there's no proven threat. And so the civilian groups start collecting reports and investigating them. And that continues on through the 1970s. What happens at the end of the or I should say, starting in the middle of the 1960s, it makes it even more embarrassing, though, is that the Air Force deals with a couple of reports, large-scale reports from dozens of people, hundreds of people in one instance, and they come out with explanations like, well, all you people in the Midwest in 1965 who reported seeing formations of UFOs were really seeing the constellation Orion. Now, the problem is that the reports were at 9, 10 o'clock at night, and Orion is not visible in the sky at that point in time of the night, at that time of day, at that time of the year. And that was really embarrassing. Then they came out with the infamous swamp gas explanation from Dr. Hynek in 66. So they got a lot of bad press. They were just doing as best they could because they didn't have other explanations. Got a lot of bad press, which left them deciding they didn't really want to deal with this at all. And so they cut a contract with the University of Colorado to finally make the academic community investigate it. Like, here's the way to get rid of it. We're actually going to pay the university to investigate it. Long story short, you can find books on all of that. The professor, Dr. Condon, who took it over, had already been writing memos about how they could make it go away even before they started the work of the project. And he finally published a report which says it's not even worth scientists looking at. This is a phenomena that doesn't even have any scientific value. You should all ignore it, which the Air Force wholeheartedly did, closing down Blue Book by 1970. So at that point in time, the intelligence community, even at the Air Force level, has exited the whole thing. And then we can go on into the 1970s. But I will say, from the 1970s on, to understand what was going on, the Air Force does not have any study program. They don't even take reports. If they call them, they'll refer you to the FAA or to one of the private UFO groups. They won't even talk to you. When something happens that is serious related to UFOs, like sightings at ICBM bases, the Northern Tier sightings that occurred in 1975 at Malmstrom, and a number of other bases across the Northern Tier states, there's no group at the Air Force level, and certainly no group at any higher level, to take those reports and investigate them. They go to, within the Air Force, they go to the command, which might be the Strategic Air Command. They might go to the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon. They might go to NORAD. But that's where they stop, and they're investigated on a one-off basis. And there's, again, no strategic level study whatsoever during the next 4 decades, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. They're just, it's not there. The intelligence community is not engaged, even in a minimal level, with it. The individual Service commands might be, but only as it relates to operational security or operational situations. So let me pause and see if we have more questions at this point.
None from Moorhead.
Nope, the only thing I could think of was you had mentioned the Air Force was kind of wanting these things to be more of a threat than anything else, or else they're not even going to bother with it. What is your opinion of it? Do you think this is a threat to our security or just a threat to the military complex?
Well, basically, that's short answer is that's the reason we launched within SCU. We launched this series of intention studies that my team's working on because nobody had done a strategic assessment. I mean, the Air Force can say it's not a threat to one of our bases, it's not a threat to one of our aircraft. We've never observed anything like that, you know, whatever. The question is there really a national security threat there? So we launched a study using the practices. If this had been kicked up to the intelligence community, to the strategic studies groups that would really have evaluated it over a long term, I mean, you need a long-term baseline of data to see if there's really a pattern in what's going on. And then you can assess various scenarios. You know, is this just, let's say it's just a study of our atomic weapons capability? That's all there is to it, regardless of who's doing it. Is it a survey of our general military capability? Is it whatever? You do a pattern study, and then you map the pattern study out and say, well, do the patterns correlate to a particular scenario? Nobody was doing that. Okay. The practices are well documented. It's called strategic threat and warning analysis. In business and marketing, it's called intentions analysis because you want to see what your competitor is doing, you know. So the practices are well defined. We kicked off this study within a team at SCU about 5 years ago. We've completed our 2 papers on what's going on in the military domain. We are now working in the public domain, and we studied the period of 47 to 70, well, basically 45 to 75 is our data, okay? Primarily off Blue Book unidentified reports and off NICAP reports that we hand curated. Everything had to be officially reported to the Air Force, to law enforcement, you know, so we did curate down the reports. Our conclusion is that what was going on in the military domain was essentially an assessment of our atomic weapons capability, not a threat, no signs of preemption, literally an assessment of what our capabilities were, what our technology was, what our weapons capabilities were, and in particular, what our weapons delivery capabilities were. Because one of the things we did was to track the patterns from the original, the pattern very clearly travels. The pattern of UFO activity over some 3 decades travels from the material sites where there's a burst of activity and that stops, to the Q storage sites, the weapon storage sites where there's a burst of activity and that stops, and then out to deployment, in particular at the missile sites. So this appears to be a survey of what you would call strategic atomic weapons capability. They're not concerned in tactical weapons. They're concerned in early on in kiloton and then megaton class weapons. And primarily, there's much more focus in the mid 60s, early 60s and mid 60s. There's much more focus on the IBM sites, continuing into the 70s than there ever was on the SAC sites, where they just had, I won't say just, but kiloton class weapons. So that's our assessment, is that no, we do not see, you know, we can only look at that data and that time frame, but during that study, we see signs of a survey and an assessment, but not a threat. And you can profile what you would expect to see if there were signs of preemption and some other scenarios, and you'll find that all in the study as to why we didn't see those. It's not a matter of not seeing it. when you look at the activity, the amount of activity over time, and kind of roll it up to which scenario fits best, that's what you see in the study. And now we're looking at what's happened with the public, and that appears to be something totally different, and a real transition from the military to the public domain starting in the mid-60s. So, long-winded answer to your question.
Okay, that's okay. I see we got another one. Chris, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, my question is, had this actually been a threat, how do you think we would have handled it, in a positive way or in a negative way?
Well, first of all, we have absolutely no way to handle the UFOs, and I can say that. I will say when I talked about that initial estimate of the situation from Air Material Command in terms of the capabilities of those objects, what they reported back in 1947 is the same thing that we're still reporting as of 2014 on. They have the same acceleration capabilities. They have the same speed. I mean, literally, they can accelerate at like 150 G. They could back then. They can now. We still have nothing. I mean, we're still wrestling with coping with a Mach 5 hypersonic weapon, you know. So literally, there's nothing we could do about them if they had been offensive in nature or wanted to preempt. So, honest answer is I think that was the embarrassing question. If the Air Force had have acknowledged that they were real and a threat, then the next question would have been just what you said, and the answer would have been surrender. You know, we can't deal with them. We just literally can't. This is a technology way beyond us. It's physics that are way beyond us, perhaps, but it's also a technology, even a materials technology. SCU has done a materials study on a couple of incidents like Aquadia and Nimitz, and it's not just a pilot, because you could have a drone. You can obviously have an AI drone that can pull 150 G. We do not have any materials for that size of craft that could stand those forces. So no, that's out of the ball. And the interesting thing, to answer your question, is it's also very clear that they weren't bashful about showing that. There's no sign of covertness. I mean, in the first years, there are lots of reports of formation flights, interactive flights between objects, daylight flights. There was never any attempt not to. In fact, it's almost counter. If you want to do inferential messaging, it's sort of like, yeah, we're here and we're really, you know, we really have something you don't. So you could recognize that. If you're looking at a contact protocol, that would be kind of like the first step. Like, we're here, we're intelligent, and okay. So again, that kind of supports there's no sign of covertness in any of this. It's just right up there in your face. And now, of course, if you're the Air Force pilot who's, you know, they're playing games with you going back and forth over North Dakota, you might feel a little threatened. But as one of our team members said, look, you can infer non-hostility when there's non-hostility. You know, like they showed that they could and they didn't.
Right, thank you.
Why don't you come on over here? You got one more.
Hey, thank you, sir. You mentioned the green fireballs. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that? I'm curious in this because I've seen something like this when I was a kid. So I'd be curious to know kind of what was that phenomenon like and what's our assessment of that? Thank you, sir.
And I have myself. I've seen them on 2 occasions. So you might notice there's a Celestron 8 telescope back there behind me. So I've been kind of a long time amateur astronomer. Starting in 1948, just about the time sign transferred to grudge, right? And like there's an attitude going on here. Over New Mexico, West Texas, Eastern Arizona, primarily New Mexico and West Texas, there were a series of literally dozens and maybe as many as hundreds, a few hundred reports of green fireballs. Literally, it looks like a bolide, looks like a very bright meteor. A couple of problems with that is that actually, one of the astronomers from my alma mater at UNM was an astrophysicist involved in meteoritics, and his whole career was devoted to studying meteors. And he got involved with the Air Force as a consultant, and immediately they were able to triangulate several of these. In a couple of instances, actually, they had been reported from below Air Force planes. So that's immediate clue. You don't have bolides and meteors, flying at 5,000 feet. That just doesn't work. So most of these, or many of these, were too low in the atmosphere to be what we would expect as meteors. Okay. So many of them actually were crossing over Los Alamos. The Los Alamos staff reported this to the Air Force, to Project Sign. Sign paid no attention to them. They reported it. The FBI got involved. Air intelligence out of Albuquerque at Sandia was very concerned about it. They actually called a series of meetings, and they brought in physicists from California, advanced people dealing with advanced aerodynamics and aircraft design and that sort of thing, to examine the sightings and the reports. And the confusing thing was that the scientists were themselves confused. It's sort of like, this can't be happening. There's no normal material that we could make a rocket out of that could, pass through the air at that altitude and not make a sonic boom. Even if, so how do you deliver that? If the fireball is a warhead or just a flare or something like that, we're not even sure how you would get it there. Interestingly enough, they came up with a concept called a pencil rocket, which would be a very, very small rocket with a flare on it that might not make a sonic boom, because sonic booms were reported with none of these. And actually, sonic booms are not that uncommon with bolides, with very bright meteors higher up in the atmosphere. So the bottom line is that for a period of about 14 months, there were a lot of these reports over this one particular area, ranging as far east as western Oklahoma and Kansas, that really had people worried, but then they stopped. And I should say they did not stop. I mean, over following years, every year you may have a report of, half a dozen green fireballs a year from all over the place, but never with that kind of frequency and that concentration as over Los Alamos and Albuquerque. So that's what made it particularly interesting and particularly worrisome as to what it might have been. There was never a meteoritics explanation. What the Air Force did actually said, look, officially we conclude that this is an atmospheric phenomenon. So we're going to study it as an atmospheric phenomena, and they launched what was called Project Twinkle. And you can look up Project Twinkle, and we'll put special cameras in place, and we'll observe it, and we'll find out what it actually is. And they did put the cameras in place. For some unknown reason, they didn't put them in the place that was getting the most reports. And by the time they got them in place, this burst of activity had stopped. So like the whole thing was, we'll explain it. And nobody ever went back and said, oh, no, we weren't able to explain it. And it just faded away. So I don't know that that's a good answer. And at this point in time, you can make of it what you will. I've seen a green fireball myself on 2 occasions. And the interesting thing about the ones I saw, and that you would expect with any bolide, is bolides always have a downward trajectory. They're entering the atmosphere and they're coming down. Many of these green fireball reports were on parallel paths, even parallel to the observing aircraft passing above or below it, or in a couple of occasions ascending paths, which is very strange. But so they don't seem like they were, even though you can do a search right now on the internet and come up with pictures of green fireballs. That's not the issue. It's how these were behaving that's very strange.
We do have a question here in Moorhead.
Yeah, going back to the 40s really briefly in Sweden with the ghost rockets. You mentioned that the Swedish authorities or the military did some analysis of some of the crash debris, and they determined it was rocket parts. I was just thinking, you know, V2 rockets, I mean, just read from what I read about World War II history, they were extremely loud. You know, when the Germans were shooting them at London, they sputtered and roared and whistled and pretty much scared the crap out of the public. But one characteristic of the ghost rockets that I've read, and it's been a while, is that they were called ghost rockets because they were quiet, like no noise at all. And I just thought that was interesting, you know, the comparison with the rocket.
I think two things to report there is that there was one class of ghost rockets, which would be more similar to the V1 pulse jet. Those did make a lot of noise. All those reports had noise associated with them, which is one of the reasons I thought they could have been V1s. For the more rocket type things, I think if most of them were seen, they made noise when they crashed, okay? But you're right, they were not reported making any noise in transit, as it were, but that would also be true for a V2. I mean, you're going to have a lot of noise when it launches, but once it's in ballistic mode, especially when it's descending, you wouldn't necessarily have any noise until it impacts. And there were noises associated with the impacts, especially one of the things that made them suspicious, and I go into this in a little bit in the book, is that the Germans had come up with really quite improved targeting on the missiles, and they could bring them down within like a mile or two. And the Russians had done the same thing. That's actually documented. And one of the things that convinced the Swedes that it probably was a rocket is that several of them impacted in the large lakes. And it's almost like somebody was targeting the lakes. So, you know, to destroy the evidence, if you would. But so there's not a perfect answer to that. But there was a lot of noise associated with the V1 types. True, but not with the rocket types. Especially the rocket types were primarily seen at a fairly high altitude or when they were descending. You know, so I'm just not sure how to answer that. But the good news is there are a lot of reports. There are a lot of reports online. If you do at Project 1947 website, I give some of the links to the reports in my book. You know, there are actually a lot of Swedish military reports that you can read now that might give you a better feel for that.
Okay. Thank you. Very interesting.
Well, maybe we need to step up to, another question or current events.
No, we're good. Go ahead, Larry.
Okay, so that's where things really existed from the 80s, 90s into the first decade of this century. Is there was no intelligence organization collecting reports. There was no collection of reports even within the Air Force, and there were certainly no strategic studies, no in pattern analysis, no intention analysis. What changed that was starting in the second decade of this century, there began to be a series of reports from military pilots, specifically Navy pilots, that were flying missions, either training missions before deployment or with task groups that were preparing to deploy, especially off Southeast US, off San Diego, or flying similar deployment area off the Southeast coast, or flying in one of the actual test ranges that are restricted flight areas off both of those. And I'm sure everybody's heard of the Nimitz case. Well, the fascinating thing is that although incidents did get reported with Navy pilots sighting UFOs, UAPs, and engaging them and maneuvering around them, the whole thing started off in the Nimitz case by an air controller on a carrier having seen so much UFO activity that they decided that it was actually a security risk, a flight security risk, to the exercises the carrier group was about to conduct. And they got permission to dispatch Navy planes out to really see what was going on, with the understanding that, you know, we might have flight risk going on here. And they did. They dispatched fighters. Those fighters encountered a UFO, imaged the UFO on video, imaged it on infrared. Two other fighters were sent out afterwards. Anyway, long story there. Everybody can look up the Nimitz incident. But the interesting thing is, it appears that that got reported, but in the context of what I've been saying, it got reported as an operations report to that task group exercise. Situations report, if you know what's going on. Yeah, we sent up planes, we had this, and it appears that there was no way for it to get beyond one level of Navy headquarters because there's no organized collection, right? So it gets reported operationally to fleet headquarters that task force is operating out of, and it stops. It goes in the files. Same thing on the East Coast. A whole series of flight security reports go to one level of reporting. They've got no place else to go. But in the interim, the Navy pilots themselves start circulating some images and talking about it. It gets on the internet, gets to the press, questions get asked, and it becomes a hot topic of discussion on the internet with UFO researchers. It gets some news coverage, and eventually Congress gets involved. And there's some interim phases in this, but just kind of catch us up on where we are now. After some questions are raised in the House in particular, legislation is passed creating the AARO. Now, it's another one of those acronyms, but let's talk about it's an office that is supposed to investigate and resolve anomalous aerospace incidents. That's a mouthful. But the interesting thing is that this is authorized within the Department of Defense. It's not with the Air Force, not with the Navy. There's this office exists as a new body empowered by Congress and empowered by legislation, but with no real command relationship to any of the services or any to the FAA, to Homeland. So it's kind of sitting over here all by itself. And how does it do its job? Well, it was hard enough to sign and blue book to do a job within the Air Force within a chain of command. Now this place gets set up, it has no staff, and it starts soliciting reports. The reports that it primarily gets, as far as we can tell, to start with, are from the Navy. We know it's kind of connected to the Navy because this is where these interceptor reports come from. But we have no view into the structure. So far, I've yet to speak to anyone that has actually even seen a form for reporting something to AARO. We have no chain of command for how the services report to it, much less FFA, or even more interestingly, Homeland. So we know that through congressional action, we've got an office set up here to deal with this subject and report on it. But to date, what they're doing is they will give a report to Congress, to the Intelligence Committee, and say, well, we've had 150 reports or 228 reports in total now, and we've looked at them, and they're mostly misidentifications. Here are, a couple of dozens. We do have some video footage that we can't explain, but objectively, they're treating it much like Blue Book did, collecting reports, looking at them one by one, and either explaining them or not explaining them. And then they just get dumped in a bucket and become statistics. There is still no strategic analysis. This is not something that any of the services wanted or asked for, nor do any of the services own it, nor does Homeland. DOD owns it, but if you've been associated with the military, DOD is Department of Defense sets over everybody, but they're not very operational. So it's not a national security level tasking. certainly no intentions or pattern analysis that we're aware of. So it's almost like a new blue book, but it's kind of worse than a new blue book because we don't know how they're taking reports. We don't know who they're taking them from. We don't get to see the reports themselves. We just get to see the buckets that they get dumped into, basically in terms of numbers. And most recently, when I looked, at this point in time, if you looked at the AARO website, which got set up in July, you will see that they have a portal. They have a portal up to take confidential reports from military or contractor personnel or someone who claims to have information, highly secure information, classified information on a retrieval, a crash, reverse engineered technology, because all of these issues were raised in a separate House committee, not so much the House Intelligence Committee. Basically disclosure stuff, if you're familiar with disclosure. They have a portal to take those. And they have some there's very interesting language in the legislation that grants anybody absolute exemption from any classification laws, any contracts, anything else. I mean, I've never seen legislation like this that says anybody can come forward anonymously, provide this information to us. You can contact us in many different ways, including this portal, and we'll look into it. So that's there. But so far, there is not any portal to take reports. There's not any portal to take UFO reports from the military or from Homeland or FAA, or much less from the public. However, the most recent report, AARO had 40 staff on board and expect to be fully operational by 2024. Now, it was created in July 2023, but it's supposed to be fully operational by the end of fiscal year. So my call would be that, again, this certainly is not what I would consider a strategic tasking in terms of priority. It's basically, how do we respond to Congress, which nothing wrong with that, but it's not a lot different in a way than Blue Book. It's just more contemporary. And there is one other thing, just within the last few weeks, another bill has been proposed in Congress to create the Safe Aerospace Act, which would allow pilots and aviation personnel to report UAP incidents, again, through a special portal anonymously, and to ensure that there are no repercussions to them from commercial aircraft, to the pilots, to their employers, anybody else, to kind of, this sounds like a good thing to collect information and ensure that it doesn't get blocked. But that legislation has not even been passed. It's been proposed. There was legislation proposed in the Senate that would have been much, much stronger than any of this, and it would have actually created an investigation board authority with legal authorities, even with subpoena power. That legislation was a rider attached to the last defense bill, and it was in joint session. Basically, all of the hard stuff was scrubbed out of it, and about the only remaining thing is that, as far as we can tell, it requires somebody, the Air Force, not quite sure who, it requires Department of Defense to turn over all its UFO files to the National Archives within a matter of weeks, like as if anybody knew where they all were or how NARA would know what they were supposed to get. Anyway, very, and not a lot of happiness with what came out of that legislation as far as in our community. So that's kind of where we are today. It feels, in a way, not much different than Blue Book, and we can't see what's going on. We don't see how the information is being collected. In the incidents that they do share with us that are unresolved, we have no information on collections, no technical information. And without that, Nothing, if we don't have the sensor systems, if we don't have the original metadata from the video, you know, we can't do anything with it. Plus, there's no sign that all the servicers are involved or that Homeland Security is involved. So it's very, it sounds good, but it's very ambiguous as to what actually might be going on. So that's kind of where we are today.
Awesome. Thank you, Larry. Really appreciate that. Does anybody have any questions? Not so much here.
Question here in Moorhead.
So, with regards to, like, say, some of the whistleblowers currently, like Michael Herrera and DC Long, if you're familiar with any of them, what's your opinion on what they've stated?
Well, the interesting thing is a lot of what I'm seeing now with the so-called whistleblowers is the same sort of thing that we have seen with the quote unquote disclosure project. I mean, a lot of it is military reports and pilot reports, which I think are very substantive. There are a lot of reports about the ICM bases, the Northern Tier sightings, a lot of pilot reports that I think are very substantial. Yes, I absolutely. What it's hard to parse out from that, the reports about the alien bodies, the reverse engineering technology, because while we actually have historical data on the ICBM and pilot incidents, we don't have that other stuff. Now, supposedly that was either given to AARO, which AARO says no, but they have created the portal and they do have laws to support collecting it. So it's hard personally, this is just a personal view for me to assess. Part of it, yeah, but there are three things going on. There are claims about UFO hard data from pilots and missile sites and the military complex that are very substantive. There's the other stuff that you can't judge because you don't have the details. And then the other thing that comes into play is the claim that this has been reported to the IG. Yet when I look at the actual complaint to the IG, it complains that people that were talking about this were harassed or taken action against because they were talking about it, which has nothing to do. I mean, that's a completely separate subject, and that's an IG whistleblower issue. That doesn't have to do with UFO data. So I'm kind of giving you a waffling answer, but it's like there are three parts to that question. The IG reporting is irrelevant to my view, and then the disclosure stuff, I still don't have any hard data. I just have reports other than the military stuff, which we've had hard data on for decades now. I mean, we can give you, our military study included extremely hard data about ICBM related reports and pilot related reports and strategic air. We've had that forever. People are coming forward with it, which is great. It's just not new. Did that answer your question, or was I off base?
Well, I guess,
I know
yeah.
it didn't answer all your question.
No, I was just, I guess I was just kind of wondering, because Michael Herrera in particular had discussed, being black site and actually meeting these people, again, since the first time. And I guess what I'm kind of wondering is, if they are claiming this and he's a whistleblower and he could face prison if he's, lying, what is stopping, I guess, the government or whomever to, they have this information, go in and say, okay, we're going to go in, we're going to find this now. I mean, I'm sure they move things quite often, but.
And that's a good point, because I can speak to that. Right now, he has absolute protection. If he goes with what he said before and goes through that AARO portal, provides that information to them, the laws, if you look at the AARO site, look at the legislation that was passed by Congress, he has absolute legal protection. Nobody could act against him. Now, could he be legally saying, could somebody be dismissive towards him in a job and he not get a promotion or whatever? Well, we all know that all happens when you say something your boss doesn't like. Okay, that's life. But legally, with this legislation that was passed last year, all of the so-called whistleblowers who have talked about alien bodies, reverse engineering technology, whatever, have absolute protection. That's why Congress passed it. Now, we don't know what's happening with that, but I can finally say he has protection. And if he can, and I've seen this before, if he could provide proof with that, along with that, if he made a report to the FBI that he was being harassed, threatened, or otherwise, he would definitely be entitled to FBI protection.
I guess I was just kind of wondering it as far as timeline, when they report this. I mean, I'm former law enforcement, military also, but I understand and everything. But with the claims that he's making, and if he has this documentation and has been there and everything, I guess I'm just kind of wondering, when are they going to actually try to pursue this, to go do something, or is it in the works, or is there more whistleblowers coming forward now?
From what I've heard, let's put it this way, and this would be the sort of conversation that occurs in the skiff. It is absolutely legal now for the Intelligence Committee to demand that AARO reveal to them each and every complaint of this nature, each and every report of this nature that has come to them. They have to. They're mandated to reveal any of those people that have said that and go to AARO. That has to be shared. It's going to be classified, but it has to be shared. So now it's kind of the onus is back on, if you said it before, but you don't go with it now. It's like, were you not serious before, or have you just been scared so much you can't? And I'm not trying to be dismissive, but right now, AARO has to report back to Congress whatever they collect on those subjects, any remains, any technology. And now what the Intelligence Committee does with it, or, I can't predict that, but I can just give you the structure of what has to occur. And I will say again, this is brand new. This never existed before. There was never any avenue to deal with this at a national security level. Now there is.
Yeah, I have a question for Larry. What do you think of the validity of what the whistleblowers are actually saying?
Okay. First of all, okay, I'm doing this a lot of time. The strange thing to me is I've seen nothing new in what the whistleblowers are saying than I saw 30 years ago. The same sort of reports, the same sort of claims, the same sort of information. So I don't see anything relatively new to it. I mean, we've had the Corso event. You've got a guy an Air Force senior officer, sorry, Army, well, anyway, who comes forth and talks about reverse engineering tech and having a task to do that. That story's been totally deconstructed. His remarks about seeing bodies are totally deconstructed. I can think of 3 or 4 incidents of that same sort where we've had people bring up these same sorts of claims before, and they've been deconstructed, okay, and disproven, literally. Nobody quite knows. I can remember a time in which we were all saying, boy, if we just had a senior officer come forth with this and say, and then he did, and no one can figure out why he even did it now, except, so it's not new to me. So maybe I'm a little bit desensitized to it. I've seen nothing in my work so far that says that we have technology that we reverse engineered, whether it's fiber optics. I mean, that several of those types of claims have been, if you look in the history of the business, when I first started with fiber optics, that's been disproven. So I've seen nothing as far as the technology transfer that convinces me. I've seen nothing that says, quite frankly, that we have, unless somebody turned us over a working craft with engineering diagrams and operational diagrams, we might be able to run it. I see no evidence that we have the physics knowledge to understand what's going on with it. It doesn't make sense to me, especially since I've kind of followed military history for so long. And if you look at what the capabilities of our own craft are now, if we got something in 1947 that we've been trying to reverse engineer, I mean, we've just gotten up to, yeah, we've got rockets that will give you, 8Gs, 10Gs. We've got hypersonics are a new thing for us, right? Mach 5, Mach 8 with steerable systems. We haven't come that far, and we've not come anywhere close to what the UFOs were profiled as having back in 1947. So maybe it's all our fault. Certainly, if somebody has turned this over to us in whole pieces, we haven't even figured out how to run it yet safely. Another factor that I have to consider just personally and subjectively is I will tell you that there are a number of reports associated with UFOs that relate to radiation and suggest that the objects themselves may be very radioactive at close distances, and whatever field or propulsion system is involved might be very dangerous to us. I will tell you, back in 1948 over Oak Ridge, there were a series of UFO sightings where actually UFOs at low altitude triggered a series of radiation monitors at the plant. Now, radiation monitors aren't scattered all over the place, so this is kind of unique. The air intelligence officer at the plant recommended to Blue Book that they establish, an observing pattern, because he had interviewed the guy who was working on one of our prototype atomic powered aircraft. And the guy said, yeah, if we flew our aircraft over this plant at that altitude, you would detect us. So one of the things that throws me off a little bit is there may be something associated with these devices and their propulsion that is dangerous to us, literally, when they're operating, which may explain why even close approaches are dangerous at a certain distance. It might explain a lot of things. I don't know. That's just one of the piece parts that nobody's really investigated. Ruppelt actually even wanted to do that. And you will find a whole series of materials in his reports that he really wanted to pursue the radiation angle and did not get to because of what happened to Blue Book. We'll tell you also that a whole team of physicists at Los Alamos did the same thing and came up with the same results. After the green fireballs, when no one would listen to them, they set up their own observations with radiation monitors and detectors and recorded the same thing. But there was nobody to listen to them either. So I think I got way off track on your question. I'm sorry. Should I go back to something?
I was just wondering what you thought of the more recent whistleblower statements and whether or not you found them to be valid, or you aware of any evidence to support that.
I will say that the law firm that handled the IG, I mean, that was the real whistleblower action from Grush, right? The law firm backed out of it and basically said, look, we're not substantiating any of this. All we're doing is representing our client in making a report to the IG. We can't vet any of the claims. We're simply sustaining his legal right to make a claim to the IG. As far as I'm concerned, we've seen nothing from the IG back. So I don't know. The IG would certainly have the power to investigate it. As far as the claims, I absolutely, honestly believe that there would be harassment, because we've seen it over and over again. When you come in with some of these kind of stories to your chain of command, the chain of command wants to discourage you. This is not something they've ever wanted to deal with. So I certainly can see elements of that as being not unusual and having happened before. As far as somebody being threatened with murder or physical harm, that seems out of line to me, just because there are so many other areas that you can discourage the reporting without doing that. So I have mixed emotions. Unless we see something back from the IG itself on that complaint, it's an open issue to me. And if I sound kind of like a conservative person, yeah, I am. Maybe because I've seen so many of this over and over again, too many years, but whatever.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, we got a question.
I
over
do,
here.
in my own defense, I have behind me on this wall a collection of all the books written by the contactees during the 40s and 50s. You know, I've been through all that. I've got books on all of the UFO cult groups. I mean, it's like not like I've not been there. So, you know, in my defense.
Yeah, Larry, this is Larry. How are you?
Hi, Larry.
Live long and prosper, okay? As kind of a preface to my question, it'll kind of give you an idea where my head is at. I grew up with my first UFO experience, not personally, but back in about 1967. My uncle was in the Air Force, went to the CIA, worked on the Skunks project for SR-71 with the Kelly Johnson team. So there's a lot of stories came out of him. He's the one that sparked my interest in aviation, which I ended up spending 23 years as a military pilot. Strangely enough, I have no experiences throughout that entire career, although the one and main experience I had was takes me back to 1972. I was growing up in a little town called Eagle Lake, Minnesota. And I hope, hopefully, if we have enough time, I can show it here. I emailed you the Google or the website to it. Maybe we have time. My question is, you kind of hit in and around this, is why is Congress or why is the government unwilling to just open the books and say, here it is? I mean, is it no, we know this and you don't? I don't get it. We've been playing this game for 75 years. Thank you.
Yeah. I think there are probably three different reasons. Certainly up until 1970, until the Air Force got back out of it, I think there were two legitimate things. The first legitimate thing is, and you and I both know, ex-military. I mean, everybody has a day job, right? And everybody has a mission. And if it's not part of the mission, it's just taking your time away from it. During this whole period of the Cold War, the Air Force and the rest of the military had one overriding mission, and that was nuclear defense against the Soviet Union. I mean, so if you could not tie something explicitly to Soviet reconnaissance, Soviet craft, if you will, whatever, this doesn't fall in my mission statement. You're just taking my time, making me look at this. Let the academics look at it. I think they were being honest. That says if this is a phenomena, even if it's extraterrestrials, whatever, unless they're a threat, they're not my business. Let the academics take a look at it. The academics overwhelmingly refused to take a look at it. I can remember they had Hynek conduct a covert survey by going to astronomy meetings, professional astronomy meetings, interviewed like 100 different astronomers. The majority of them said they were interested in the subject. A few of them had said things themselves, but it would absolutely kill their academic career if they admitted it, and they would never say so in public. And he reported that back to Blue Book, as a matter of fact, or might have been Grudge at that time. He did it fairly early on. So there's always been this, if they're not hostile, they're not part of my mission. And if they're not scientifically, they're not predictable and repetitive, and I can't really study them on an organized structure, they're not academic either. So they're nobody's job, military or whatever. The interesting thing, though, is all of those records, if you will, all of those records from the Blue Book era, all the Blue Book files have been released to us. So they weren't protected forever. Nobody was scared that we would ever see them. And there are some truly sensational incidents in there, not only from the interceptor encounters, but from the ICBM bases, even back to the early 60s, the SAC flights. Truly fascinating. So they didn't protect that. They didn't destroy it. They didn't throw away. It's now public. Then we run into the fact that between 1970 and 2000 something, nobody was collecting it at all. It just was not there. If it was there, it was in an ops report, or it was in, a deck log off a carrier or something like that. And that stuff gets shredded after certain, documents control practices. So it went away. Now, I guess the kicker is, now why aren't they giving it to us? And the answer is always sources and methods. And you and I both know, anybody that's been with the military, they don't want to tell you what collections capability they have, what sensor systems they have, where they're looking, how good they are, whatever. We're just now, right now in 2023, we're seeing all of the detailed engineering records off the spy satellites from the 60s and early 70s. And it's fascinating stuff. But we don't get to see that until 50 years later because they were protecting capabilities. So that appears to be what they're protecting right now. I mean, that's official. They will, AARO will not let us see, and SCU has requested them. We want the technical details on their unidentified reports. They will not give them to us because if they gave us what we needed to study them, they would reveal their capabilities. That's kind of like three answers to your question. I don't think, I think they know and have always known intuitively that UFOs are real, that they're there, that they're intelligent, they're beyond our capabilities. That's not what they know that. They just can't say that publicly because then they would really be forced to deal with them and they can't deal with them. But as early as back in 1952, one of Ruppel's peoples did what was called a motion study of UFO formation flight from an engineering pattern study that says, look, these have to be intelligent. They're maneuvering with each other at this distance and this formation. I've studied their angles. This is not birds. This has to be intelligent. And he made that argument, and it just didn't go anywhere because, like, that's, you know, so are they threatening and intelligent? No, apparently not. None of the formations have done it. Did they fly over an air base at 500 feet? Yeah. Okay. Did they drop anything? No. Again, I'm not trying to be dismissive, but this is to some extent, this is as much as a socio-psychological cultural problem as it is a UFO problem. Larry, did I get off topic again? I'm sorry. Was I close enough?
Yeah, that's good.
How do you do? So what is your take on the MIB phenomenon sometimes preceding a significant UFO sighting? Men in Black?
Yeah, familiar with the MIB. I think my take is twofold. We know one thing for certain. We now have seen several incidents in which we know the people that were reported as mysterious, sometimes in black, sometimes not, just mysterious and representing themselves as government agents or whatever, unidentified, were actually UFO researchers. So one of the things is that's contaminated that whole area because we know of actual real incidents where UFO researchers would go into an area where there'd been one or two. John Keel is an example with the Kentucky situation where there had just been a few Mothman things, and he went in and people started doing questioning, and then suddenly there's this huge burst of Mothman reportings. We also know that the military, in particular, the Air Force, has done that. If you've read Project Beta, the book, if you've read, there are a couple of books on how active Air Force intelligence, not intelligence, I should say, counterintelligence, has been at penetrating UFO reports, UFO report groups like AARO in the early days, and literally spreading disinformation to protect what was in Project Beta, as an example. An engineering manager in Albuquerque started reporting to APRO, seeing some things at Sandia Base that he thought were UFOs. Air intelligence, counterintelligence got involved. The whole upshot of the thing was they were very concerned that, and this goes all the way back to the Robertson panel, that Soviet intelligence would use UFO groups as a source of open collections on US technology development. Well, in this instance, we have a proven case where the Air Force started feeding him misinformation, really nasty misinformation. The guy ended up committing suicide. And this was done by actual intelligence operatives, plus some other people, UFO researchers, that were participating with him, feeding him information from the backside to confirm that these were aliens, when they were not at all. This was a series of tests going on at the base, air base near Albuquerque. So again, I followed that from the very beginning. There are a couple of very good books on the first UFO researcher that brought this up in the beginning. I could refer them to you if you're interested in, and really originated the concept of the men in black, and that show about how that came about. That the honest answer is, I see a lot of things going on, but none of it that I could actually attribute to quote unquote aliens. That may just be because I'm suspicious of everybody.
Yeah, hi. I'm just kind of curious if you could just kind of speak on what kind of work that SCU does. I know I just read through your report that you guys released last month, and I'm kind of curious moving forward in the next couple of years what you guys do in terms of researching or even looking at different data here and there. If you could just speak to that.
Yeah. The primary mission for SCU is really literally scientific investigation. And as such, I and my team are kind of outriders because we're not doing pure science. We're doing intelligence. And we're applying practices out of strategic intelligence where you can't do real science. The events are unpredictable. They're not repeatable. You have to have a very long-term chronological database. It's not real science. And SCU has been pretty good in letting us go along with that because it is rigorous and it is methodological. And no matter how many times our science advisor chides me, it's kind of like, okay, as long as you're transparent, show your methodology, you can proceed. But what SCU is really about is doing scientific studies with technical data, radar data, video data, imaging data. They want to get in a position of actually doing data collections, but up to this point in time, it's published about 4 or 5 different reports using radar data and imaging data, the case in Texas, the Aquadia case in Puerto Rico, that are all studies of anomalous aerial objects that would confirm those insane accelerations and maneuvers and speeds that show it's anomalous and unconventional. So that's what a SCU would like to do a lot of, but it's also doing, we've all published one chemistry and actually 3 different chemical and materials analysis studies. Robert Powell, my friend, has published material studies again that show that's his career field is metallurgy, and that have analyzed physical samples as far as chemical constituents and whether they are, normal or not normal and atypical, and so how much so. We've had another report on a chemical study from the circle in Kansas, if anybody's familiar with that, where the ground was actually calcified and changed under the UFO, and he goes into the chemical structure analysis. So SCU is really about doing scientific research. At this point in time, other than our intelligence work, it's been primarily physical analysis studies, and that's what it would like to do. We'd like to come up with, it's not that we don't want to do social science studies. Out of 280 some members, about a third of those are social scientists, but it's just so hard to get your hands around social studies type data that so far we don't actually have a working project in that yet. We'd like to, and maybe in the future, but mostly what we do is we take in the last year or so, we've had several proposals. One of the more recent one was on studying Skylink satellite reportings to determine when a UAP could be matched to Skylink and when not, because that's been a real issue for pilots in particular, to see something strange and actually it's a Skylink either launch or insertion into orbit or partial insertion into orbit or decay, whatever. We have a paper working on that. There have been, the answer to your question is we like to take topics that reference that can really be studied through chemistry, physics, in a more pure science manner, and offer proof. We actually issued a press release saying we objected to both the NASA study committee and the AARO study committee when they said they didn't have any valid scientific examples. And we literally issued a press release and said, yes, we do. Come look at them. Strangely enough, no one has been knocking on the door.
And of course, that doesn't surprise any of us.
No, I can't say that we were shocked or appalled, but it's
Yeah.
sort of like we figured we needed to do that. But that is published, and all of these are peer reviewed. The recent intention study that we're working on now is 8 months with 3 peer reviewers and now 3 SCU reviewers in progress. Just that it took 2 years to do the study, and now we're 8 months into peer review.
Well, thank you, Larry. We really appreciate it. Does anybody have any other questions? Because we're kind of getting close on time.
It looks like Lou does.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I remember Roswell like it happened yesterday because I was a kid home on the farm. But what about all the stuff Bob Lazar talks about?
I have to say I've devoted a fair amount of time to Lazar and to people that knew him, that have done studies on him. This is just a personal opinion. This is just me speaking. I honestly can't give any credit to it. There are people that have told they're part of disclosure that has talked about studies that I can relate to and would give some credit to and still am open-minded about, but I'm afraid in regard to Lazar, I'm just not. So sorry there. And I remember Roswell, I was born in 1947. We won't make anything out of that other than maybe I arrived then. I don't know.
A question was asked whether you could watch the recording of this meeting, and that'll be on northlandmufon.com as soon as I get done editing it. So other than that, Larry, thank you very much for presenting for us today. We really appreciate it. Hopefully we can have you back next week or at sometime this year. You know what I mean?
I'd be happy to do it. And if anybody wants to drop me a question, I'll give you my email. It's Larry Joe, all one word, LARRYJOE at WestOK, WESTOK, which is West Oklahoma, .net. So if anybody wants to drop me an email, I'd be happy to respond that way too. And you all have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry.
Okay, let's get through this real quick. Okay, so there was Larry. Thank you very much, Larry. Shout out to everybody that's helped out with the chapter with donations and stuff like that, and even giving your time. Michelle, thank you very much for helping out with the snacks. Warren, thanks for helping out with the snacks as well. Larry, thanks for helping with all that back there. Really appreciate it, all of it. Okay, we have a joke of the day that I have to get through. So, why were there only 18 letters in the alphabet? Anybody over in Moorhead figure that one out?
I don't think so.
No? Nobody knows why there's only 18 letters? Okay. Because ET flew off in a UFO and the CIA chased after him. So there you go. Okay, membership clarification. I talked about that earlier. MUFON.com versus Northland.com. You sign up on MUFON.com, you're automatically a member of Minnesota MUFON and Northland MUFON, both. The financials on that, like I said, MUFON.com, they keep all that. The chapters don't see anything, so we're just working off of donations. To become a field investigator, I know a lot of you guys are asking about that. Come see me after this because, like I said, we're out of time. So,
Hey, Jared,
yes.
I would like to congratulate our new field investigator, Charles, who's here at our meeting.
Oh,
He has
awesome.
passed his test, so
Congratulations, Charles. That's great.
Thank you.
And that's it. So next month, we're going to have Kathleen Martin. For those of you who don't know who she is the niece of Betty and Barney Hill. Yeah, so that's going to be a really exciting one. We're kind of looking forward to that. In March, we're going to have Stan Gordon. He does a lot of Bigfoot stuff, and he does a lot of UFO stuff. And he's going to be doing a presentation on UFOs, ETs, Bigfoot, orbs, the connection to the whole thing. So that'll be real fun. Next meeting is, it'll be a Saturday. It will be February 17th.
In the Fargo Moorhead area, we will not be at the Moorhead Public Library at the next meeting. We will be at the Fargo Public Library in Northport. So I just wanted to make sure that people were aware.
On that, y'all have a great weekend. Thank you very much for coming out.
The meeting's over. Why are you still here? Doesn't make any sense. Go home. Go.